It was the kind of humid, heavy afternoon that clings to your skin, the air thick with the smell of unburnt hydrocarbons and pulverized clay. Memorial Day weekend, 1954. We're standing on the edge of a dirt oval carved into the rolling landscape just outside of Pittsburgh, a place where the industrial smog of the steel mills meets the rural quiet of the farmland. The track is locally known as Thunder Valley, a name earned not from the weather, but from the acoustic violence that occurs when 20 unsilenced V8 engines scream in unison against the surrounding limestone cliffs. In the pit lane, the hierarchy of American capitalism is on full display, laid out in steel and rubber for everyone to see. On one side, you have the establishment. You have the factory-backed teens, the local dealership owners, the guys who show up with matching coveralls and trailers that cost more than most families' houses. They are running 1954 Chevrolets and pristine Mercury coupes, their paint gleaming under the summer sun, their engines built by professional machinists who measure tolerances in 10,000ths of an inch. These are the guys who have spent thousands of dollars chasing horsepower, buying the best carburetors, the most aggressive camshafts, and the most exotic cylinder heads that money can buy. They look at the sport of racing as a transaction. You put money in, you get speed out. And then, sitting quietly at the far end of the paddock, separated from the aristocrats of the asphalt by an invisible barrier of class and budget, is a beat-up primer gray 1953 Ford. It looks tired. It looks heavy. It looks like it was driven here straight from a shift at the colliery, which, as it turns out, it basically was. Leaning against a fender is a man who looks out of place in this high-octane Harnival. He isn't wearing a racing suit with stitched logos. He's wearing work trousers and a stained white t-shirt. His hands are permanently etched with the black grime of the coal seams, a tattoo of labor that no amount of scrubbing can remove. His name is Frank Kowalski. And the other drivers, the ones with the expensive haulers and the polished grins, have already written him off. To them, he's just field filler, a moving pylon to be lapped on the way to the winner's circle. They look at his car and see a stock flathead V8, a relic of pre-war engineering that should be wheezing and dying against their modern overhead valve power plants. They see a man who cannot possibly understand the complexities of fluid dynamics or thermal efficiency because he didn't go to engineering school in Detroit. They see a coal miner who should stick to digging rocks. But they are wrong. They are catastrophically, embarrassingly wrong. What they don't know, as they rev their engines and check their tire pressures, is that Frank Kowalski has something hidden inside his rusty exhaust pipes that is worth more than their entire budget. It is a secret weapon that cost him exactly $20 and a Tuesday night of welding. It is a modification so counterintuitive, so bizarre, and so technically offensive to the conventional wisdom of 1954 that if he showed it to them, they would laugh in their face. Yet in about 30 laps, when the dust settles and the sun dips below the tree line, Frank isn't just going to beat them, he is going to humiliate them. He is going to take his heavy, underpowered scrap metal Ford and drive past their high-dollar machines as if they're standing still, leaving them choking in his dust and wondering if the laws of physics have suddenly changed. And the most beautiful part of this entire scenario is that nobody, not the engineers, not the mechanics, not the track officials, will be able to figure out how he did it. To understand the magnitude of what is about to happen on this dirt track, we have to pull back and look at the world of 1954. It is a unique moment in history. The Second World War is over, but its echoes are still vibrating through the American consciousness. Millions of young men have returned home from Europe and the Pacific, and they have come back changed. They are no longer content to sit on front porches and listen to the radio. They had spent years maintaining Sherman tanks in the mud of France, rebuilding aircraft engines on the decks of carriers in the South Pacific, and keeping Jeeps running with nothing but baling wire and ingenuity. They have returned with a specific set of skills, a deep, tactile understanding of mechanics, and a desperate need for adrenaline. The result is an explosion of grassroots motorsport that the country has never seen before. Every weekend, across the Midwest and the South, old fairgrounds and farmers' fields are being bulldozed into racetracks. If you can flatten the dirt enough to slide a car sideways, you have a venue. The rules in this era are beautifully simple, almost primitive by modern standards. You take a stock car, a regular passenger vehicle that you can buy from a dealership, and you strip out the glass and the seats. You keep the body stock, you keep the frame stock, but when it comes to the engine, the rulebook basically shrugs and says, do whatever you want. This freedom sparked the golden age of hot rodding. It was an arms race of combustion. In garages from California to Pennsylvania, guys were tearing into engines, trying to squeeze every last drop of power out of the iron blocks. The flathead Ford V8 was the king of this era, the engine that mobilized a generation. But by the mid-50s, it was showing its age. Everyone knew the standard recipe for making it go faster. It was predictable. You bored out the cylinders to increase displacement, you ported and polished the intake runners to get more air and fuel into the combustion chamber, you slapped on multiple carburetors, sometimes 3 or 4 of them, looking like a mechanical pipe organ sitting on top of the manifold. If you were wealthy, you bought aftermarket cylinder heads from legendary names like Offenhauser or Edelbrock, increasing the compression ratio to dangerous levels. A fully built race engine in 1954 could cost upwards of $2,000, which was enough money to buy a brand new car and a decent plot of land. The barrier to entry was rising, and speed was becoming a commodity that was sold to the highest bidder. However, despite all this money and all this effort, every single racer was hitting the same invisible wall. It didn't matter how much they spent or how shiny their parts were. Eventually, the physics of the flathead engine would betray them. The problem was heat and flow. The flathead Ford V8 was notorious for its terrible exhaust design. The exhaust passages had to route through the engine block itself, twisting and turning through the cooling jacket before finally exiting. As you increase the horsepower, you increase the volume of hot gas that needed to escape. At high RPM, when the engine was spinning at 4,000 or 5,000 revolutions per minute, the exhaust simply couldn't get out fast enough. It was a traffic jam of superheated gas. Backpressure would build up in the system, literally pushing back against the pistons as they tried to rise, robbing the engine of power and overheating the valves. It was a suffocating sensation for the machine. The engine wanted to run. It had the fuel and the air to run, but it couldn't exhale. It was like asking a sprinter to run a marathon while breathing through a drinking straw. The racers threw everything they had at this problem. The logic of the day, the common sense that dominated the pit lanes, was that bigger is always better. If the engine can't breathe, give it a bigger pipe. So they started welding up massive exhaust systems. They ran 3-inch pipes, huge sewer-sized conduits that looked ridiculous hanging under the chassis. They bypassed mufflers entirely, running straight pipes that shattered eardrums 3 towns over. Some of the more desperate mechanics even ran zoomy-hairs, short individual pipes for each cylinder that pointed straight at the ground, blowing dust everywhere and making the car sound like a machine gun. But here was the frustrating paradox. Often, the cars with the biggest, most expensive exhaust systems actually went slower. They made more noise, certainly. They looked more aggressive. But on the track, coming out of the corners, they would stumble. They lacked torque. The engines felt lazy, unresponsive. The expensive modifications were actually making the problem worse. But because the bigger is better dogma was so entrenched in the culture of American excess, nobody questioned it. They just assumed they needed even bigger pipes, or more carburetors, or more money. They were trapped in a cycle of diminishing returns, throwing cash at a physics problem they didn't understand. And while they were all looking in one direction, obsessing over size and volume, Frank Kowalski was in his garage, looking in the complete opposite direction. Frank Kowalski was not a man who spent his time reading hot rod magazines or debating the finer points of aerodynamics. He was a creature of the underground. Born in 1922 in the anthracite heartland of western Pennsylvania, his destiny had been written in carbon before he even took his first breath. His grandfather had died in a tunnel collapse. His father coughed up black phlegm every morning until the day his heart gave out. And Frank, inevitably, had followed them down into the dark. By 1950, he had spent 14 years of his life in the mines. This is a crucial detail because working in a coal mine changes the way a human being processes information. In that environment, there is no room for theory. There is no margin for error. You are hundreds of feet beneath the surface of the Earth, surrounded by millions of tons of rock that wants to crush you, and the air you breathe is a precious, finite resource that has to be mechanically pumped down to you. If the ventilation fails, pockets of odorless methane gas accumulate in the ceiling. One spark, one mistake, and the entire shaft becomes an inferno. In this high-stakes world, Frank became obsessed with airflow. It wasn't a hobby, it was a matter of survival. He learned the intricate language of gases. He watched how the massive ventilation fans on the surface pushed air through miles of twisting tunnels. He noticed how the air moved differently depending on the shape of the shaft. He saw that sometimes, when a tunnel narrowed or when there was a sudden restriction, the air didn't slow down as you might expect. Instead, it sped up. It would rush through the bottleneck with incredible ferocity, creating a powerful draft that could suck the stagnant, dangerous gas out of the dead corners of the mine. He learned that pressure and velocity were two sides of the same coin, and that by manipulating one, you could control the other. He didn't know the mathematical formulas for the Bernoulli principle or the Venturi effect, but he felt them in his lungs every day. He knew that sometimes, to make air move faster, you had to squeeze it. This was the piece of counterintuitive wisdom that was bouncing around in his head the night he stared at the exhaust system of his 1953 Ford. He had just finished the shift, scrubbing the coal dust from his pores with harsh lice soap, and he was looking at the stock exhaust manifold. It was a crude iron casting, dumping into a standard 2-inch pipe. He thought about the racers he had seen at the track, the ones welding on giant sewer pipes, trying to reduce restriction to zero. And then he thought about the mine ventilation. He remembered a specific incident where an engineer had tried to improve airflow in a damp section of the mine by widening a passage, only to find the air grew stagnant and lazy. The solution had been to install a restrictor plate, a literal wall with a smaller hole, which forced the air to accelerate, creating a jet stream that cleared the dampness in minutes. Frank looked at his Ford, then at the pile of scrap metal in the corner of his garage, and wondered, is an engine just an air pump? Does it obey the rules of the track or the rules of the mine? That Tuesday night, fueled by a hunch and a few cheap beers, Frank did something that would have made a professional engineer scream in horror. He took a piece of half-inch thick steel plate, remnants of an old mining cart he'd salvaged. He cut out 2 rough circles, sized to fit inside his exhaust pipes. Then he drilled a hole in the center of each plate. But he didn't make them big, he made them small. Shockingly small. One hole was 1 1/4 inches, the other was 1 3/8 inches. He was essentially taking a 2-inch pipe and blocking off more than half of its area. He was deliberately choking his engine. By every conventional rule of racing, he was destroying performance. He was adding a roadblock to the exhaust flow. He took a hacksaw, cut a slot into the exhaust pipes right where they bolted to the manifold, slid these metal washers in like bread into a toaster, and welded the pipes back together. The whole operation took 45 minutes. The cost was negligible, scraps from the trash and a few welding rods. When he lowered the hood, the car looked exactly the same. But when he turned the key, the sound was different. It wasn't necessarily louder, but it was sharper. The idle had a crisp, staccato rhythm to it, like a snare drum being hit with a steel stick. Frank backed the car out of the driveway and onto the empty rural road near his house. He rolled onto the throttle. At low speeds, putting around the neighborhood, the car felt normal, maybe a little sluggish. But then he found a straight stretch of asphalt and mashed the pedal to the floor. The flathead V8 roared, the tachometer needle climbing steadily. 2,000 RPM, 3,000 RPM. This was the zone where the engine usually felt strong. But as the needle swept past 3,500, the moment where the stock exhaust usually started to choke and wheeze, something strange happened. The engine didn't flatten out, it woke up. At 4,000 RPM, the car surged forward with a violence Frank had never felt before. The engine note changed from a low rumble to a high-pitched, tearing shriek. It wasn't struggling to exhale anymore, it was singing. The needle buried itself past 5,000 RPM, a speed that should have floated the valves and choked the motor, but it just kept pulling. Frank let off the gas, his heart hammering against his ribs. The car slowed down, the exhaust popping and crackling with a menacing energy. He tried it again. Same result. The wall at 4,500 RPM was gone. It had been obliterated by two washers with holes in them. What Frank had accidentally engineered was a scavenging system. By forcing the exhaust gas through that small hole, he was dramatically increasing its velocity. The gas had to speed up to get through the restriction, and that high-speed jet of air shooting into the larger pipe downstream created a powerful vacuum behind it. This vacuum literally sucked the exhaust out of the combustion chamber, pulling fresh fuel and air in behind it more efficiently than any expensive cylinder head ever could. He had turned the exhaust system into a vacuum pump, using the energy of the escaping gas to supercharge the engine's breathing. He didn't know the physics, but his right foot told him everything he needed to know. He had just unlocked 15, maybe 20 horsepower, and he had done it for the price of a lunch. The weekend of the race arrived. Frank rolled into Thunder Valley with his Ford, the welds on his exhaust pipes hidden underneath the chassis, invisible to the prying eyes of the tech inspectors. The atmosphere was electric with arrogance. The big teams were there, the ones with the shiny trailers. Tommy Novak, the local legend who ran a machine shop and drove a terrifyingly fast 48 Mercury, was holding court near the concession stand. Novak's car was a masterpiece of checkbook engineering, polished, chromed, and loud. When Frank parked his dusty Ford next to Novak's pristine Mercury, a few of the pit crew guys sniggered. They saw the stock tires, they saw the dents in the bumper. One of them, a mechanic with grease under his fingernails but clean coveralls, walked over and kicked Frank's tire. "You lost, Cole boy?" he asked, grinning at his friends. "Tracks for race cars, parking lots out back." Frank didn't get angry. He didn't say a word. He just popped the trunk, took out his helmet, an old leather football helmet he'd painted white, and started taping up his headlights. He knew something they didn't. He knew that in about an hour, that smirk was going to be wiped off the mechanic's face by a cloud of dust and the taillights of a '53 Ford. The practice laps were the first warning sign, a subtle tremor before the earthquake. As the cars circled the half-mile oval, churning the track surface into a tacky brown paste, the auditory landscape began to shift. The spectators in the wooden grandstands, shielding their eyes from the glare, were used to the chaotic, uneven rumble of amateur race cars. They were accustomed to engines that popped on deceleration, that wheezed coming out of corners. But every time Frank's Ford passed the start-finish line, heads turned. It didn't have the booming, bass-heavy resonance of the big block Mercuries. Instead, it emitted a tight, focused rasp, a sound that cut through the ambient noise like a bandsaw. It sounded efficient, it sounded angry, and more importantly, it was fast. In the straights, where the expensive cars usually stretched their legs and pulled away, Frank was glued to their bumpers. He wasn't gaining on them with brute horsepower, he was hanging onto them with sheer, unadulterated revs. Tommy Novak, the king of the local circuit, noticed it immediately. During a break in the practice session, he walked over to Frank's pit area, wiping grease from his hands with a red shop rag. He circled the gray Ford like a predator, inspecting a confusing new animal. He looked at the tires, the suspension, the carburetor. Everything looked stock. He leaned into the window where Frank was sitting, calmly drinking a bottle of lukewarm cola. "You're pushing that thing pretty hard, coal miner," Novak said, his voice dripping with condescension but laced with a hint of genuine confusion. "That flathead is gonna blow if you keep winding it like that. You got what, $3,000 in that motor?" Frank just looked at him, his face a mask of indifference. "Nope," he said. "Stock crank, stock heads. Just a little tune-up." Novak laughed, a harsh barking sound. "Tune-up," he scoffed. "You're pacing a bored-and-stroked Mercury. Don't lie to me. You're running nitro, aren't you?" Frank didn't answer. He just put his helmet back on and stared straight ahead. The main event was a 30-lap feature race, 30 laps of violence on a deteriorating dirt surface. Frank drew the 15th starting position, burying him deep in the middle of the pack. This was the most dangerous place to be. It was the meat grinder, where inexperienced drivers panicked and fenders got crumpled. When the green flag dropped, the world dissolved into a brown haze. Dust billowed up instantly, choking the air, reducing visibility to zero. The roar of 20 engines was deafening, a physical pressure that vibrated in your chest. For the first 10 laps, it was pure survival. Cars were sliding sideways, bouncing off the ruts, banging doors. Frank stayed calm. He drove with the economy of motion he had learned operating heavy machinery.
No wasted movements. He kept the car low in the corners, hugging the inside line, protecting his radiator from the flying rocks kicked up by the cars ahead.
By lap 12, the field had begun to stretch out. The pretenders were falling back, their engines overheating or their nerves failing. Up front, Tommy Novak was leading, his bright red Mercury cutting a clean line through the dirt. Behind him was a menacing black 1941 Willys Coupe and a 1954 Chevy. They were the elite, the untouchables. Frank was running 7th, but he was finding a rhythm. And this is where the $20 modification began to show its teeth. The standard racing line at Thunder Valley required a specific dance. You charged into the corner, braked hard, downshifted into second gear to keep the revs up, slid through the apex, and then mashed the gas. But as you accelerated out, you hit that dreaded dead spot, that moment before the engine climbed back into its power band. Every other driver was fighting this lag. They would stomp the pedal and wait a split second for the car to respond. Frank didn't have to wait. Because of the restrictor plates, his exhaust velocity was sky high. His engine scavenged so efficiently that he had torque everywhere. He discovered he didn't even need to downshift. He could leave the car in high gear, carry more speed into the corner, and when he hit the gas, the Ford would just pull. It was instantaneous. While the other drivers were busy shifting gears and losing momentum, Frank was simply driving away from them. On lap 18, he caught the second group of cars, a cluster of 3 Chevys fighting for 4th place. They were blocking the track, weaving back and forth. Frank waited for the back straight. As they came out of turn 2, the Chevy drivers shifted gears, their engines momentarily dropping in tone. Frank stayed on the throttle. His engine screamed past 4,500 RPM, the restrictor plates creating that magical vacuum effect, pulling the exhaust out and shoving fresh power in. He slingshotted past 2 of them in a single motion, splitting the gap like a needle through fabric. The crowd, sensing something impossible was happening, actually rose to their feet. The gray Ford, the ugly duckling, was eating the field alive. Lap 25, 5 laps to go. Frank was now in 4th place. He could see the leaders. The dust was clearing slightly as the pack thinned. He reeled in the 3rd place Chevy on turn 3, diving inside with a move that was borderline reckless but calculated perfectly. The Chevy driver, startled to see a primer gray fender in his peripheral vision, flinched and drifted wide. Frank was through. 3rd place. Now it was just him, the Willys, and Novak. The establishment was directly in his crosshairs. The Willys Coupe was fast in a straight line, built for drag racing more than circle tracks. But in the corners, it was a boat. Frank stalked him for 2 laps, learning his weakness. On lap 28, entering turn 4, the Willys braked early. Frank didn't brake. He pitched the Ford sideways, drifting the rear end out, scrubbing speed with friction rather than brakes. He came out of the slide pointed straight at the finish line, while the Willys was still struggling for traction. The Ford's engine sang that high, tearing note, 5,000, 5,200, 5,500 RPM. He blasted past the Willys before they even hit the start-finish line. 2nd place. White flag. 1 lap to go. It was just Frank and Tommy Novak. The Mercury was 2 car lengths ahead. Novak was driving defensively now, glancing in his mirror, terrified by the gray shape that had risen from the dead to haunt him. He blocked the inside line. He blocked the middle. He was forcing Frank to the outside, up near the wall where the dirt was loose and slippery. It was a suicide line. Nobody passed on the outside at Thunder Valley. It was physics. The long way around was slower, and the lack of grip usually sent you into the fence. But Frank wasn't driving on physics. He was driving on flow. He threw the Ford into the high line. The rear tires clawed for grip in the loose marbles. The car shuddered, threatening to spin. Frank corrected, his hands a blur on the massive steering wheel. He kept his foot planted. The restrictor plates were doing their work, keeping the engine in the sweet spot of the power band even as the tires spun. He pulled alongside Novak on the back straight. Novak looked over, his eyes wide with disbelief. He saw Frank. He saw the coal miner looking back at him, calm as a statue. They entered the final turn side by side. Novak had the inside, the preferred line, but his heavy Mercury pushed, drifting up the track just a few inches.
Frank, carrying more momentum, pinned the throttle. The Ford hunkered down. The engine wailed, a banshee scream of mechanical triumph. It didn't choke, it didn't stumble, it just revved. Frank surged ahead by a fender, then a hood, then half a car length. He crossed the finish line in a cloud of glory, the checkered flag waving frantically.
The silence that followed in the pits was heavy. The crowd was going berserk, but the racers were quiet, stunned. Frank parked his steaming car, pulled off his helmet, and wiped the sweat from his eyes. Before he could even unbuckle, a shadow fell over his door. It was Novak, and he wasn't alone. Behind him were 3 other drivers and the track technical inspector. They didn't look happy. They looked like men who had just seen a magic trick and were demanding to see the hidden wires. "Pop the hood," Novak demanded, his voice shaking with adrenaline and rage. "Pop the damn hood, Frank. I want to see the blower. I want to see the nitrous. Nobody goes that fast with a flathead." Frank stepped out of the car, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached through the grill and unlatched the hood. He lifted it. The crowd of mechanics leaned in, expecting to see a monster, expecting to see chrome and wires and cheating. What they saw was nothing. A dirty, oil-stained flathead V8. 2 carburetors, which was legal. Stock heads, painted a rusty red. Standard ignition. It was the most boring engine bay they had ever seen. The inspector leaned in, checking the fuel lines, checking the displacement. "It's clean," he muttered, baffled. "It's a legal motor, Tommy." Novak's face turned purple. "Bull," he shouted. "Look at the exhaust. Listen to it. He's doing something." Frank smiled then, a small, tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You want to know the secret, Tommy?" he asked softly. The group went silent. "I just helped it breathe, same way we breathe in the mines. Sometimes to go fast, you gotta squeeze tight." He reached down and tapped the exhaust pipe right where the invisible weld held the restrictor plate. $20, Frank whispered. "Beat your $3,000. And in that moment, the hierarchy of the racing world didn't just crack, it shattered. The weeks following Memorial Day were a comedy of errors in the garages of Western Pennsylvania. The secret of Frank's trick had leaked, as secrets in racing always do, but it had leaked imperfectly. The rumor mill, functioning like a game of telephone played by men with hearing loss and welding torches, had distorted the truth. Racers knew Frank had done something to his exhaust. They knew it involved restriction, but they didn't know the math. They didn't understand the delicate balance of pressure and velocity that Frank had intuited from his days underground. So they guessed, and they guessed wrong. One racer, convinced that if a little restriction was good, a lot of restriction must be better, welded washers with half-inch holes into his pipes. His engine started, idled for 10 seconds, turned bright red from the trapped heat, and then blew a head gasket with a sound like a shotgun blast. Another competitor, Tommy Novak himself, tried to replicate the plates but installed them too far downstream, near the mufflers. The result was a car that sounded like a strangled vacuum cleaner and lost 10 miles per hour on the straightaway. The pits became a graveyard of melted pistons and cracked manifolds, all sacrificed on the altar of cargo cult engineering. They were copying the form without understanding the function. Frank, meanwhile, continued his campaign of dominance. He won the next 3 races at Thunder Valley. He traveled to Ohio and won on a paved oval. He went to West Virginia and won on a clay track that was so rough it broke the axles of 3 other cars. He was unstoppable. The Kowalski Ford became a boogeyman for the establishment. Promoters started paying him appearance fees, $50 just to show up, because crowds wanted to see the coal miner who embarrassed the rich boys. It was a brief, shining moment where the natural order of the world was inverted. The guy with the dirty hands was beating the guys with the clean fingernails, and the public loved it. But the establishment does not like to be embarrassed. It tolerates the underdog only as long as he loses eventually. When he keeps winning, he becomes a problem. The complaints to the race officials grew louder. They demanded teardowns. They demanded fuel tests. Every time Frank's car passed, it was clean. It was legal. It was just better. This infuriated the corporate-backed teams. They couldn't accept that a garage hack was superior to their purchase speed. It violated their worldview. In their minds, speed was a product you bought, not a riddle you solved. One evening in July, a man in a crisp linen suit approached Frank in the pits. He introduced himself as the owner of a large Chevrolet dealership in Pittsburgh, a man who sponsored 3 race cars, all of which Frank had beaten that afternoon. He didn't look at Frank. He looked at the car, his eyes scanning the machine with a mixture of greed and disdain. "I'm a businessman, Frank," he said, lighting a cigarette with a gold lighter. "I don't like losing. My mechanics tell me you're doing something with the backpressure. They can't figure it out." He took a long drag. "I'll give you $500 for the rights to it. Cash, tonight. You show us exactly how to do it, and you agree not to share it with anyone else." $500. In 1954, that was a fortune. It was 6 months of wages in the mine. It was a new roof for his house. It was security. Frank wiped his hands on a rag, looked at the money, and then looked at the man. "I can't sell it to you," Frank said simply. The businessman bristled. "Why? You think it's worth more? Fine, $700. Frank shook his head, smiling that same cryptic smile. "No, you don't understand. I can't sell it because it's not a product. It's just physics. It's air. Besides, I already told 3 guys how to do it this morning. If your mechanics want to know, tell them to come over here. I'll draw them a diagram for free." The businessman stared at him, his mouth slightly open. He couldn't process this. In his world, advantage was property. It was something to be hoarded, patented, and monetized. The idea that someone would give away a competitive edge just because they enjoyed the shared pursuit of speed was alien to him. He crushed his cigarette into the dirt, turned on his heel, and walked away. "You're a fool, Kowalski. You'll die poor." He was right, of course. Frank would die poor, but he was also wrong. Frank wasn't a fool. He was a purist. He represented a philosophy of innovation that was rapidly dying out. The idea of open-source knowledge, shared among peers for the betterment of the craft. This clash between the garage and the boardroom was happening all over America, but nowhere was it starker than in the automotive industry. In Detroit, engineers with degrees from MIT and Purdue were sitting in air-conditioned offices, designing the future of the V8 engine. They worked in a world of theory. They used slide rules and dynamometers. Their Bible was the textbook. And the textbook said that exhaust systems should be large, free-flowing, and unrestricted. They spent millions of dollars designing manifolds that looked good on paper, but performed mediocrely on the street. Meanwhile, in a wooden garage in Pennsylvania, a man who had never seen a college campus was rewriting the laws of gas dynamics using scrap metal. Frank was an empiricist. He didn't care what the theory said. He cared what the engine did. If the theory said, "make it bigger," and the engine said, "make it smaller," he listened to the engine. This is the tragic flaw of institutional engineering. It falls in love with its own models. It assumes that because the math is elegant, the result must be correct. It ignores the messy, chaotic reality of the physical world. Frank lived in that reality. He dealt with the mess every day. By 1956, the secret was out. Not sold, but diffused. The racers who had listened to Frank, who had actually paid attention to the details of placement and hole size, started to find speed. The technique migrated. It moved from the dirt tracks of Pennsylvania to the drag strips of Ohio, and eventually out to the hot rod meccas of California. It ceased to be Frank's trick. It lost its name. It just became that thing you do with washers, or the restriction mod. It became folk wisdom, passed down from older mechanics to younger ones, usually without any explanation of why it worked, only that it did. Detroit eventually caught up, but it took them a decade. In the mid-60s, Ford and Chrysler began releasing high-performance exhaust manifolds. They featured strange, pinched sections and cone-shaped restrictors at the flanges. The marketing brochures called it anti-reversion technology, or tune velocity scavenging. They filed patents. They published white papers. The engineers patted themselves on the back for their brilliance, accepting awards and bonuses for discovering something that a coal miner had figured out 10 years earlier to win a $50 bet. Did they steal it? Maybe. Maybe a junior engineer saw a hot rod at a drag strip with welded washers and got an idea. Or maybe they just finally stumbled upon the same truth through millions of dollars of research. It doesn't really matter. The result was the same. The corporate machine absorbed the innovation, sanitized it, stamped a part number on it, and sold it back to the public at a premium. The history books recorded the patents. They recorded the names of the lead engineers. They did not record the name of Frank Kowalski. Frank watched this happen from a distance. He read the magazines. He saw the ads for the revolutionary new headers that used the exact same principle he had welded into his Ford. He didn't write angry letters. He didn't hire a lawyer. He just kept working. By 1959, the toll of the mines was catching up to him. His back was ruined, his discs crushed from years of crouching in 4-foot seams. His lungs were stiffening with the early stages of black lung. The racing had to stop. The vibration of the car was too much pain to bear. He sold the '53 Ford to a kid from the next town over. He didn't tell the kid about the washers. He figured if the boy had the touch, he'd find them. If he didn't, it wouldn't matter anyway. Frank opened a small repair shop, fixing family sedans and farm trucks. He faded into the background, just another mechanic in a grease-stained jumpsuit. The trophies gathered dust in his attic. The glory days of Thunder Valley became stories he told his children, who listened with half-hearted interest, not really understanding that their father had once been a giant. They saw a tired man with a bad back, not a genius who had outsmarted the combined might of the American automotive industry. And this brings us to the tragedy. Not the tragedy of Frank's life, he was happy enough in his own way, but the tragedy of lost potential. How many Franks are there? How many brilliant solutions are currently sitting in garages, or on farm workbenches, or in the minds of people who are too busy surviving to file a patent? We live in a society that fetishes credentials. We assume that innovation flows from the top down, from the ivory tower to the masses. But history, if you look closely, shows the opposite. The steam engine, the airplane, the telephone, these things often start with obsession and scrap metal, not grant money. The scavenger plate phenomenon reappeared in 2008. A company released a product that was essentially Frank's washer system, laser cut from stainless steel, packaged in a glossy box, and sold for $350. They claimed it was a breakthrough in fluid dynamics. They had computer simulations to prove it. A few old-timers on internet forums pointed out the similarity to the old hot rod tricks of the 50s. They were dismissed as nostalgic ramblers. The cycle had completed itself. The $20 hack had been gentrified, repackaged, and sold to a new generation who thought they were buying cutting-edge science. Frank Kowalski passed away in 1993. He was 71 years old. The obituary in the local paper was brief, a standard 3-inch column tucked between a notice for a church bake sale and a report on local road repairs. It listed his survivors, a wife, 3 children, 4 grandchildren. It mentioned his military service during the war, his 30 years in the mines, and his time as a small business owner. It said he was a devoted father and a hard worker. What it did not mention was that for 3 glorious summers in the mid-1950s, he had been the smartest man in Pennsylvania. It didn't mention that he cracked the code that baffled engineers with PhDs. It didn't say a word about the gray Ford, the Thunder Valley Speedway, or the $20 piece of scrap metal that had humiliated the racing elite. To the world, he was just another dead coal miner. To history, he was a ghost. But legacies are funny things. They don't always live in statues or history books. Sometimes they live in the mechanical DNA of the machines we use every day. If you look under the hood of a modern race car or even a high-performance street car, you will see the echoes of Frank's garage. You will see headers that step down in size. You will see anti-reversion chambers. You will see the physical manifestation of the idea that he welded together on a Tuesday night in 1954. His name isn't stamped on the metal, but his logic is. He is an anonymous architect of speed, one of the thousands of silent contributors who built the modern world with dirty hands and zero recognition. This story isn't just about exhaust pipes. It's a mirror for how we view intelligence. We are taught to trust the complex solution over the simple one. We are taught that if something costs more, it must be better. We believe that experts are the only ones allowed to innovate. Frank's story tears that belief down. It proves that sometimes the expert is wrong because he is trapped by his own rules. The outsider, the amateur, the guy who just wants to go faster, he has the freedom to be irrational. And in that irrationality, he finds the breakthroughs that the rational mind can't see. Frank didn't succeed despite being a miner. He succeeded because of it. He took knowledge from one world and smashed it into another. That is the essence of true creativity. It's not about inventing something from nothing. It's about seeing the connection that everyone else missed. So here is the challenge to you. Walk out into your garage tonight. Look at that project car that's been sitting on jack stands for 6 months. Look at the problem that has you stumped. The one you think you can't solve because you can't afford the expensive part or the special tool. Stop thinking like a consumer. Stop thinking like a student. Start thinking like a miner. Ask yourself, what is the simplest, dumbest way to make this work? Ignore the forums. Ignore the right way to do it. Just look at the physics. Look at the flow. Maybe the solution isn't a $1,000 order from a catalog. Maybe it's a piece of scrap metal leaning against a wall. Maybe it's a washer from the hardware store. Maybe it's something you already have, waiting for you to see it with fresh eyes. There's a little bit of Frank Kowalski in everyone who has ever picked up a wrench. It's that voice that says, I can make this better. Listen to that voice. Trust your hands, because the next great innovation isn't going to come from a corporate boardroom. It's going to come from a garage, late at night, from someone just like you who refuses to accept that it can't be done. Frank never got his patent, he never got his fame, but he got something better. He got the satisfaction of knowing. He stood in the pits, surrounded by confused men with expensive machines, and he knew something they didn't. He knew the secret. And for a brief, fleeting moment, that secret made him the king of the world.